Morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Um,
Yes.
so in the last lecture on 23rd September, we went through this proof of why K5 is non-planar using the Jordan curve theorem, right? And there was a pesky issue we ran into. Some of you were not convinced that the vertex VI belongs to the interior of CI. So let me just make the drawing again. So the drawing looked something like this. We had V1, V2, V3, and this cycle closed curve was called C. Um, and we argued that, well, V4, let's say we place it inside without loss of generality. Then we put the edges V1, V4, V2, V4, and V3, V4, right? And this will give us so now we construct three cycles here. We consider this to be C1, we consider this to be C2, and we consider this to be C3. Okay? And the issue we ran into was that why must the vertex VI be not in the interior of CI? So in this drawing, for example, this is the interior of C1. Okay? And likewise, this is the interior of C2 and this is the interior of C3. Okay? And the issue we ran into was, why is it the case that V1, for example, is not in the interior of C1? Right? Of course, if you look at this drawing, then it's kind of obvious, but we wanted to get an explanation that does not rely so heavily on the drawing, because the drawing could be misleading. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So in particular, is Anand here? Anand George, are you here? Okay. I guess he's not here, so probably we'll listen to it later. So does anybody have an explanation for this? I mean, there are various explanations you can come up with, and they differ in the level of rigor. I will talk about rigor versus intuition once we finish this argument, especially in the context of planarity. Does anybody have an explanation which was different than the ones we discussed last time? Okay. If not, then I would like to provide an explanation, which will hopefully be more rigorous than the ones we discussed last time. Let's see. So let's do it step by step. The problem is, okay, Samuel says Anand and I discussed, and we were not able to come up. Uh, we were not able to come up with a solid proof. Right, right. So let's see if we have a slightly more rigorous proof today. But I will talk a little bit more about rigor versus intuition once I'm done with this explanation. So consider the following. Supposing you have a closed curve, C, and you take 4 points that appear in order. V1, maybe I'll use a different notation. U1, U2, U3, U4. And now supposing I want to go from U1 to U3, but I want to stay in the interior. So I want to join U1 to U3, and I also want to join U2 to U4. Okay, using curves. I want to join them using curves. Okay, then do you agree that these two curves will have to cross? Does that seem agreeable?
I'm sorry, sir. Why can't we put Q on the outside?
No. I want to connect them by staying in the interior. I want to connect them while staying in the interior. So P and Q, P connects, P is an arc, P is an arc joining arc in the interior of C1, interior of C, joining U1 and U3. And likewise, Q is an arc joining U2 and U4. Okay? Then do you
Yeah,
agree
then they
that
need
P
to.
and Q must cross?
Yes.
In that way, it must cross, right?
Okay. Anand, Samuel, others?
It seems obvious, but I'm not sure why it has to be true.
Okay. Okay. Fine. So let's assume this for the time being. Okay. Let's assume this for the time being, and we can think about why this is true later. Okay. Fine. So if that seems agreeable, then let's try to now prove the previous statement using this, and then we can later think about why this is true. Okay. Maybe not in the lectures, maybe after the lectures you can think about this statement. Okay. So if you believe that statement, right, we will think about a rigorous proof of that later. Okay. So if you believe that statement, then here is another way to prove this part. Okay. So rather than drawing everything at one time, let me go step by step. Let me first put, so I want to argue V1 is not in the interior of C1. So let me first put a curve joining V2 and V3. Okay. Now what happens here is that this creates two more regions. This is one region and this is another region. Okay, we are actually going to call them faces in a few minutes. And now, in order to go from this point here, in order to go from some point here to V1, you must cross this curve. Okay? And that is because, I mean, if you can go there without crossing this line I've drawn, then that would mean that V1 and this point here, this crossed point here, they belong to the same region. Okay? So if we assume the previous statement, then it means that once you have drawn this part, you cannot join this point here to V1. And now if you were to put one more line, then that wouldn't change what we just discussed, right? And this is, remember, this is C1. So this is why V1 is not in the interior of C1. Because if V1 were in the interior of C1, then you would be able to connect this point to V1 by an arc without crossing any of the lines we have drawn. And that would contradict the observation we just discussed earlier, right? So now it just remains to discuss the previous observation. If you take 4 points and you try to connect them through the interior, then these two will cross. Does that make sense?
So this is going to sound very silly,
Okay.
but the Jordan curve theorem says that when you have like a closed curve, it divides the entire plane into two regions.
Right.
But here, when you draw this curve V2 to V3, that extra curve,
Yeah.
you claim that it divides the interior of the triangle into two regions.
Right.
That seems very obvious, but
Uh-huh.
like we can't get that from Jordan curve theorem, right?
Right. It's not immediate from Jordan curve theorem. But let me give you some explanation for that. If you have a closed curve and you join 2 points on the closed curve through the interior, right? Now, when you apply the Jordan curve theorem to the curve, you know that there are two regions, the interior of the C and the exterior of the C, right? And now the claim is, well, so here is where you use some more topological arguments. If you take any epsilon ball around this point, let's say, what happens is that you can join this any point in this epsilon ball. There are two sides of the curve. So there are two sides of the curve, this side and this side. And any point on this side, you take an epsilon ball, you take any point at epsilon distance, it can be connected to any point within an epsilon distance of this curve, right? And so what we are saying is that now we have three regions because we are able to connect any 2 points on this side and we are able to connect any 2 points on this side. But we can't connect a point here with a point here, because to connect a point here with a point here, we must go through the curve. And so that's how you argue that you have created at least one more region. And then you argue that, well, there are exactly three regions in the plane now. But yeah, this requires some topological arguments using epsilon kind of stuff, right? But we won't be going into that level of rigor.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so there are some things that we will kind of draw. Yeah, so maybe I'll just now say a few things about rigor versus intuition in the context of planarity. Yeah, so for most of this course, we will be very rigorous, right? Whether it is connectivity, whether it is matchings, we are going to be extremely rigorous. But this is not going to be the case in planarity, because planarity heavily depends on topology, right? And most of us, including myself, have never taken a rigorous course in topology, and we won't have time to cover the in-depth rigor of topology in this course. So we will have to draw a line, pun intended, between rigor and intuition, right? So if we try to make things too rigorous, one, we might lose too much time and we won't be able to cover the algorithmic aspects. And two, it might actually lead to a lack of intuition for some other students, right? So we need to kind of strike a balance between rigor and intuition when discussing planarity. The good thing about the plane is that it is a surface that you are used to on a daily basis. For example, you take this mouse in my hand, right? This mouse is basically what they call topologically homeomorphic to a plane. You take most of the objects around you, they are going to be topologically equivalent to a plane. So luckily the plane is a surface that we are very used to on a daily basis, right? And so our intuition, most statements that seem intuitively true on the plane also happen to be true, except they require a rigorous proof if you want to be really rigorous, right? So just because it seems intuitively true doesn't mean it is true, right? One still needs a proof. But luckily in the case of the plane, most things that seem intuitively true happen to be true even if you go through a rigorous route. One example is the Jordan curve theorem itself, right? So if there are things that we would like to discuss that require more explanation, then let's do them at the end of the lecture, or let's have additional sessions for that, right? But we will have to draw a bit of a line between rigor and intuition during the lectures. Yeah? Does that make sense? For instance, if we were discussing another surface like the torus, I wouldn't do this. But luckily in the case of the plane, we are going to be safe if we rely on intuition at times. And since the main focus is the algorithmic part of the course, we will have to kind of draw a line when it comes to rigor, when it comes to planarity. Yeah? But of course, don't hold yourself back from asking questions. If you feel that some more explanation is required, I might just do those explanations at the end of the lecture. And I might also have to think about them myself, right? Because I am also very used to thinking about planarity intuitively. And getting rigorous explanations is sometimes quite tricky. Right? Is everybody with me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool. Thanks. So in that case, let's move on to Krotowski's theorem that we discussed last time. So we proved the easy direction of Krotowski's theorem, which says that if a graph is a subgraph, that is a subdivision of K5 or K33, then the graph is non-planar, right? And this easy direction, we basically use two facts, which I did not state explicitly. One fact is that if a graph is planar, then any subdivision of that graph is planar, right? So subdivision just means that you replace a path, you replace an edge by a path, right? So that would be a subdivision. And you can do this for any number of edges you like, right? So just for the sake of formalism, K33 is a subdivision of K33 because you replaced each edge by an edge. You did not do any subdividing, okay? So okay, so if that is a question you have in mind, then we are going to consider any graph to be a subdivision of itself, okay? But a more interesting subdivision is where you replace some edges by paths, okay? So we use that fact, and the other fact we use is that if a graph is a non-planar subgraph, then the graph itself is non-planar, okay? And that proves the easy direction of Krotowski's theorem. The difficult direction, which is far more difficult, is that if a graph is non-planar, then it has to contain a subdivision of K5 or K33. And that we will not be proving in this course. If you are interested in proving or knowing the proof of that, then I recommend taking the graph theory, the structural graph theory course that I hope to offer next semester. It depends on the Senate and other factors. Okay? All right, are there any questions about Krotowski's theorem? Is it clear why Krotowski's theorem implies that the decision problem is in CoNP? The main decision problem of this module is decide whether a given graph is planar. Okay, so if there are no questions in this portion, then let's move on. Okay, so now I want to talk about faces of a plane graph. Something that I called regions a few minutes back. The graph theory term for it is faces. And again, this is a topic where we will rely on intuition quite a bit. We will be drawing graphs or curves that are not too complicated, and we will rely quite a bit on intuition again. Okay? Okay, good. So let's take an example. Maybe I want to take this example. Also, if it helps, for those who are finding certain statements harder to believe, if it helps, maybe you can assume Fari's theorem, right? So that might make it easier to believe certain statements, right? Of course, Fari's theorem is again a statement we did not prove, right? Yeah. So what are the faces of a plane graph? So I will just put down what the faces in this graph are. One of them is this region, F1, F2. The other one is F3, F4. And there is one more, which is the outside, right? The unbounded face. Of course, I might refer to it as the unbounded face, but I want you to remember that there is no real distinction between the unbounded face and any other face. any face could be the unbounded face. For example, let's label the vertices v1, v2, v3, v4, v5, v6. Okay. So for example, you could ask me, could I redraw this graph so that f1 is the unbounded face? Can we redraw? So I have not written down a formal definition of a face yet, but I will write it down in a few minutes. Can we redraw this graph G? Actually, let me call it G tilde. Because it's a plane graph. Can we redraw G tilde so that V1, V2, V3 is the unbounded face? Okay. And here is how you do it. You can check that these two graphs are the same. Okay, the graphs are the same. The plane graphs are not the same. So if this is G tilde, this could be G1 tilde, right? But the abstract graph is the same. Okay. And of course, the more rigorous explanation of why any face can be drawn as the unbounded face is think of drawing the graph on a sphere. And on the sphere, there is nothing that is unbounded. They are all bounded. And so the rigorous explanation is through stereographic projections. Okay. Anything that can be drawn on the plane can be drawn on the sphere and vice versa. Okay. So what exactly is a face more rigorously? Actually, yeah, that's fine. I wanted to make a different drawing. It's okay. I'll redraw another graph. So a plane graph, G tilde, induces a partition of the rest of the plane right? So what does rest mean? You remove the graph itself from the plane, right? So you remove all the lines, all the curves of the plane graph of the rest of the plane into a collection of disjoint arcwise connected open sets. Okay. And these sets are called the faces of the graph. And in order to denote the collection of faces or the set of faces, we will use the notation capital F of G tilde. Okay. Good. In fact, I would like to not use F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. Okay. Good. All right. One extremely important point that I want to remark is that for a planar graph, there is no such concept as faces. You cannot talk about the faces of a planar graph because in order to talk about faces, you need an embedding, right? This is a topological concept. Vertices and edges of a graph are not topological concepts. They are graph theoretical concepts. But in order to talk about the faces, you really need an embedding in order to discuss this. And to make this point even clearer, I want to discuss one more example. Okay? It's similar to the previous example. So consider this graph. I have removed one edge from the previous graph. Okay, consider this graph here. So in this part, so the graph is G. This particular embedding we are looking at is G1 tilde. Okay, let's label the vertices 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now I want to give you a different embedding of this graph. What does it mean to be different? I'm not going to make this very formal and rigorous because it's not going to be important for the algorithmic content of this course. But I will just try to explain by an example what I mean by different. Okay? What I want is, so what are the faces of this graph? This is, let's say, F1. This is F2. This is F3. And this is F4. Okay? What is F1 here? You can think of F1 as being defined by its boundary. Okay, I will define boundary in a few minutes. But what is the boundary of F1? Let me not write down. I'm just going to say F1 is 1, 2, 3, 1. It is bounded by the cycle 1, 2, 3. F2 has boundary 1, 3, 2, 5, 6, 4, 1. F3 is 4, 5, 6, 4. And F4 is 1, 2, 5, 4. So in this particular example, the boundary of each face, which I have not defined again rigorously, it looks like a cycle, right? It is a cycle of the graph, right? What I want to do, so what are the lengths of these cycles? This cycle is length 3. This cycle is length 6. This cycle is length 3. And this cycle is length 4. Okay? What I want to do is I want to get a different drawing of this graph. I want to get a different embedding of this graph such that the lengths of the faces are not the same as the one we have right now. Can anybody tell me how to do this? Can you redraw this graph so that the lengths of the faces are not 3, 6, 3, and 4? I want them to be different. I'm going to ask someone to answer. Ricky Dev, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Hi. Can you suggest to me how I can redraw this graph so that I get different, the faces lengths are different?
Yeah, so maybe you can put the vertex 3
Yes.
outside the circle
Okay.
1, 4, 5, 2.
Okay, fantastic. So let's do that. So I'm going to draw more or less the same thing. I'm going to make one change. Sorry, you go by Ricky or Dev? I think I've asked you before, sorry.
Ricky.
Okay, Ricky, thanks. Right, so let's look at this embedding as suggested by Ricky. Okay, so what we did, let me make the drawing slightly smaller so that you can see it on the same page. So what we did is we flipped the vertex 3 outside, right? And now let's see what the faces lengths are. So one of the faces is F1 prime, F2 prime, F3 prime, and F4 prime. And let's call this G2 tilde. Okay, this is a different plane graph, but the planar graph is the same. Okay. Now what are the lengths of the faces? I won't write down everything. The length of F1 prime is 3. The length of F2 prime, you can check, is now 5. The length of F3 prime is now 3. And the length of F4 prime is 5. Okay, so instead of 3, 3, 6, 4, you now have 3, 3, 5, 5. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so this is why it's really crucial to keep in mind that for a planar graph, there is no such concept as faces, because if you tell me that this is your planar graph, then which embedding are you referring to? Is it the first one whose faces are length 3, 3, 6, 4, or is it the second one, right? So whenever referring to faces, it is extremely crucial that you are talking about a plane graph or a planar embedding of a planar graph and not just a planar graph, right? Okay. Good. Are there any questions regarding what we just did? Okay. Good. All right. So in that case, I would like to proceed to prove a few statements about faces so that we have a bit more familiarity with working with faces. Let's see what I want to proceed to prove. Okay. Let me make this concept of the length of a face more rigorous. So in these examples that we studied, in the examples so far, the boundary, which I have not defined, the boundary of each face was a cycle of the graph. Okay? But that does not always have to be the case. Can somebody try to give me an example, as simple as it can be? It doesn't matter how simple it is. Can somebody give me an example of a plane graph where the boundary is not a cycle?
K2.
K2, thank you. So let's look at K2. Right? Here, what is the boundary? There's only, how many faces are there here?
1.
Exactly. So there's only one face, and that is this face here. Right? I mean, it's unbounded, but it doesn't matter. And the boundary of that face is just this edge, right? But we are going to consider the boundary to be a closed walk. What we will do is we will walk along the boundary and we will consider the boundary to be this closed walk. So you go from 1, then you go to 2, and then you come back to 1. So we will say that the boundary is actually go from 1, go to 2, and go back to 1. Okay? So it is not a cycle, but it is a closed walk, which is a generalization of a cycle. Okay? Let's take a slightly more complicated example. but not too complicated. Consider this graph. Okay. And so how many faces here?
3.
3. F1, oh, maybe not. F1, F2, and F3. Okay. And if I were to label the vertices 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then we are going to consider the boundary of F2 to be the closed walk starting at 1, for example. You go like this. And you come back to this point, right? So you start at 1, for example, doesn't matter where you start. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 4, 2, 3, 1. Notice that all the examples I'm drawing are simple graphs, so I can just write sequences of vertices. But if I was dealing with multi-graphs with multiple edges, then I would need to specify sets of edges, right? But here it is very clear. 1, 2 means the edge 1, 2, 2, 4 means the edge 2, 4, 4, 5, and so on, right? So here I can just think about sets of vertices, an ordered set of vertices, right? So we will mostly restrict ourselves to simple graphs, as is the case in life generally. Why? One of the reasons is that, think for yourself, if a graph is planar, if a multi-graph is planar, then, well, let me put it differently. A multi-graph is planar if and only if the underlying simple graph is planar. So this graph is planar if and only if this graph is planar, right? Again, we will not prove this rigorously. It's intuitively clear. You generally, what you do is you take an epsilon ball around this edge, and you can always squeeze in another edge in that epsilon ball, right? But we will just assume this to be true, right? So in general, we will restrict ourselves to simple graphs. Okay, good. So then what is the boundary? We will just write down again what seems to be intuitively true. If G is connected, then each face is bounded by a closed walk. Okay, and this closed walk is called the boundary of the face. Oh, what happened? Something went wrong? No, it's okay. Called the boundary of the face. Why is connected necessary? That should be fairly clear. For example, if this is my graph, then the boundary of this face is no longer a closed walk. I mean, I can start here, I can go here, but in some sense, this is also part of the boundary, right? So we won't worry about it because a graph is planar if and only if each connected component is planar. So again, when dealing with planarity or almost anything in this course, we will kind of assume that the graphs are connected, right? So we won't worry about these kinds of cases. Good. All right. Are there any questions about faces, boundary, etc.? Again, we are relying quite a bit on intuition. So that is true. But yeah, that's because we don't want to get into topological details too much, right? Okay. All right. Okay, so now I want to discuss. So let's go back to some of our examples. How many vertices are there in this graph? 6, right? The number of edges is, how can you count the number of edges? Well, you count some of the degrees of the vertices. 3 plus 3, 6, plus 3, 9, plus 3, 12, 14, 16, and so it is 8. Right? And how many faces do we have? One, two, three, 4. Right? Notice that even in this embedding, the number of faces was the same. It was equal to 4. Right? Although it is a different embedding of the same planar graph, the number of faces did not change. Right? So the number of faces again, G2 tilde, is equal to 4. So although we have the same planar graph and we have two different embeddings, the number of faces in both embeddings is exactly the same. Well, it turns out that is not a coincidence. That is actually because of Euler's formula that you will be proving in the first assignment that I will be putting up by tonight. Okay? So what Euler's formula says is that for any plane graph, I like to write it in the following way. I don't know, I have a bit of an aversion to subtraction. So I like to write it as just plus signs. The number of vertices plus the number of faces is equal to the number of edges plus 2. Let's see. In this example here, 6 plus 4 is equal to 8 plus 2. So why is this 2 coming up? So if you are curious why is it 2, well, the answer to that is that if you study topology, there is a thing called the genus of a surface. We won't be defining genus. And if you, basically there's a generalization of Euler's formula that works for all surfaces. And instead of 2, you put the genus of the surface, right? But we won't be going into that. Okay? So Euler's formula for plane graphs. Okay? And this is really cool, right? Why is it really cool? Why is this really cool? Well, what it tells you is that the number of faces does not depend on the planar embedding, because the number of faces is simply the number of edges of the graph minus the number of vertices of the graph plus 2. And these two quantities do not depend on the embedding, right? If your planar graph is G, you can just write the number of edges in G rather than the number of edges in the plane graph, right? Where G is the underlying plane graph. Planar graph. Right? So for a planar graph, the number of faces maybe for a planar graph G, any two planar embeddings G1 tilde and G2 tilde have the same number of faces. Right? So in particular, you can talk about the number of faces in a planar graph. You can talk about the number of faces of a planar graph, but you can't talk about the faces of a planar graph, right? The number of faces is invariant, but the actual faces, the boundaries of the faces, these can change. These can depend on the embedding, right? But interestingly, the number does not depend on the embedding. Okay. Are there any questions?
I missed the part where why the 2 is added in that formula.
Well, we are not proving it here. You are going to be proving it on the assignment. So we are not, okay. So the proof of this assignment, the proof of this is on the assignment. Why 2? So the intuitive explanation for 2, or not, maybe not even the intuitive, but let's say the sort of the more deep explanation of why is it 2. The point is it's 2 for the plane. The Euler's formula, there is a generalization for all surfaces, but we are not going to discuss other surfaces in this graph because that would be a course on topology. So if you were thinking about another surface, for example, a donut, or mathematically the torus. So maybe you can read about the torus. So torus is a different surface. And so what would happen in Euler's formula is that instead of 2, you would have the genus of the torus. And 2 is actually the genus of the plane. So the genus of the plane, whatever that means, is equal to 2. But we will not be defining genus in this course. So you can read about it if you're curious on some source or like Wikipedia, right?
Okay.
But you will be proving the formula for the plane on assignment 1. And to prove it, you will be using ear decompositions. Okay, I will put the assignment 1 out tonight, by tonight. Okay. Good, good. Any other questions? Any other discussion? All right.
So a planar graph need not be too connected, right?
A planar graph need not be too connected. It need not even be 2 edge connected like this graph.
So why are we using ear decompositions?
Oh, right. You will be using ear decompositions for 2 edge connected graphs, and then you will be generalizing it to connected graphs using a different argument.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's right. There are 2 parts to the question. Okay. Good. All right. There is another thing I want to discuss, but we will not finish that today. We will continue it in the next lecture. Oh yeah, we are already on time. So what we are going to prove in the next lecture is we are going to prove another consequence of Euler's formula. Next lecture. We will prove corollary of Euler's formula. Which says that for any plane connected graph, you have the following Right. So you have the following bound. The number of edges is less than equal to 3 times the number of vertices minus 6 for any planar connected graph. You need one condition, that the number of vertices has to be at least 3. Otherwise, you have small counterexamples. We will be proving that this bound, again, you have to assume that this is a simple graph. Otherwise, of course, you can keep adding parallel edges. So we are going to prove this bound. And one consequence of this bound is that the order of m, the number of edges, is the same as the order of n. Okay, so if you find any algorithm that is order m, then that is also an order n algorithm, right? In general, we have order m is the same as order n square. But for planarity, the number of edges is linear in the number of vertices. And so we will prove this next time on Monday, right? And on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we will complete an algorithm on planarity, a polynomial time algorithm. And you will be proving that it is polynomial time on the assignment. But you will have at least 5 days to complete that question of the assignment. Okay, so most other questions, you should already be able to start attempting them. But you will have at least 5 days to attempt those questions that rely on the algorithm. Okay, are there any other questions, discussions? I'm here for another 10-15 minutes. The lecture is officially over, but please stay back if you have any questions.
So the decision problem for proving that a graph is planar or not.
Yeah.
To show that it's in CoNP, we need to show the existence of some subgraph, which is a subdivision of K33 or K5, right?
Yes.
So can we prove that there are a polynomial number of such subgraphs?
You mean the number of subdivisions of K5 or K33, is that a polynomial number?
Or like how do we show that there's a polynomial algorithm for that?
Oh, no. So that's not necessary, right? For a problem to be in CoNP, there is no requirement of an algorithm. CoNP simply means that there is a certificate that can be verified in polynomial time. So in other words, if I want to convince you, for example, here is the Peterson graph. If I want to convince you that this graph is non-planar, right? All I need to do is I need to show you that there is a subgraph of this graph that is a subdivision of K33 or K5.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will actually tell you, and you can figure out why these graphs are the same. So for example, there is another way to draw the Peterson graph, which I learned from my advisor. You take K33, you subdivide these 3 edges. These 3 edges constitute a perfect matching of the graph, but we'll talk about that in module 3. You take these 3 edges and you subdivide them, and you join a new vertex and join to all 3 of these vertices. Okay? You can check that these 2 graphs are actually the same. Now, what I will do is I will just show you that, hey, this graph G has a subgraph H. And H is a subdivision of K33. It does not matter how I find it. I am just going to somehow magically produce this, right? CoNP and NP, they are not about algorithms. They are about certificates. So I will just give you the subgraph, which is a subdivision of K33. And now you can check that it is a subdivision of K33. So there is a certificate. There exists a certificate that can be verified in polynomial time. It can be verified. It cannot be found. We are not saying that we can find it in polynomial time, but it can be verified in polynomial time. So the question is, the important thing is there exists a certificate and its verification should be doable in polynomial time. For a problem to be in NP or co-NP, NP or co-NP, it is not necessary to find the certificate in polytime. For example, if you are used to the Turing machine definition of co-NP, what you would do is you would take a graph G, and it is a non-deterministic Turing machine. You would just run for all subgraphs. You will take any subgraph of G, and you will check if that subgraph is a subdivision of K5 or K33, right? So it is a non-deterministic Turing machine. You have lots of branches because it's non-deterministic. And for each subgraph of the graph, you check whether that subgraph is a subdivision of K5 or K33. And that can be checked in polynomial time. Think about that. If I give you a subgraph, you should be able to check in polynomial time whether that subgraph is a subdivision of K5 or K33. That is doable in polynomial time, right? And so a non-deterministic Turing machine will halt in polynomial time. It will find an accepting state or a non-accepting state in polynomial time, depending whether you are thinking of co-NP or NP. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So we know it's in NP, we know it's in co-NP, but we haven't yet said anything about whether it's in P or not.
That's right. That's right. So that is the crux of the remaining module.
Okay, so is it in P or?
It is.
Not
It is
yet.
in P. It is in P. Yes. Every problem, more or less every problem we are discussing in this course, except for Hamiltonian cycle in module 0, is going to be a polynomial time solvable problem. But the algorithms are often non-trivial.
All right, sure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Sir, just to take a detour, are there
Yeah.
problems which are not in P but are in both NP and co-NP?
That's a very good point. So I can't think of problems right now. Let me see. Let me think about this. Do I know of problems? Yes, I think. Oh no, actually no. There was one very famous example, which was primality testing. For a long time, people knew that checking whether a number is prime or not, deciding whether a number is prime or not, is in NP and it is in co-NP. And for a long time, people believed that it should be in polynomial time, but nobody could find an algorithm for primality testing in P until in the last 10-15 years, when some researchers at IIT Kanpur did.
Yes.
Right?
All theory courses have this tagline.
Sorry?
All theory professors in IIT Madras are always, giving this information in their courses, because it was BTech students who did the paper, right? So
yes, there were BTech students involved in the project. That is true.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, someone called Nitin Saxena, the advisor was Manindra Agarwal, and there was another BTech student, I think.
Yes.
That's right. Yes. So that was a very major breakthrough. One of the few such big theoretical CS breakthroughs coming from India. Let's hope we have more in the future.
Nisha, the prime factorization is in NP and co-NP,
Yes.
but it's not known to be NP.
Oh, that's right. Factorization. Thank you, Govind. Factorization is a problem that is in NP and co-NP. Why? Because, so what is the problem? What do we have to decide?
So you're given integers n and k in binary, and you have to output whether n has a prime factor that is at most k.
Oh, I see. I see. So the decision problem is to decide whether n has a prime factor that is at most k. Why is it in NP? That is clear because I just give you a prime factor that is at most k and you can check it. Why is it in co-NP? Because I just give you a prime factorization of the problem of the number, and that is clear then that none of the numbers is at most k, for example. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. But how do you find the prime factors in P? Thanks. So yeah, so Govind is the answer to that question. The prime factorization decision problem is in NP and co-NP, but is not yet known to be in P. And in fact, I think many people believe that it might not be in P, right?
I think that fact is used in cryptography, right?
That's
To-
right. Cryptography hardness is based on that. A lot of cryptography hardness is based on the assumption that prime factorization is not in P. Good, good. Thanks. I can't think of any graph theoretical problems right now. So we have number theoretical problems, but I will see if there are any graph theoretical problems of a similar status.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
you said you didn't have like a formal